reality, one God, one life, one way, one reality.
So in other words, they were just saying, I'm just going to live by the seat of my pants. I'm not really going to make an effort to do good by anybody else because nobody really does for me. And it's sad that there are people who probably think that way. That's the old saying, embodied, in my opinion, the old saying that says, well, nobody will ever, or that'll never happen, or nobody will ever do that, when it comes to doing right. And this is what he's saying, is that, Adam, us, we're supposed to try to achieve that level of perfecting ourselves so that we not only do good for ourselves in a positive way, but the rest of the world. And that's what generates that reconciling of the world, that correction of the world. But everybody wants a supernatural event to do it for them. They don't want to take action into it.
That's the real issue. When you study the Tanakh puts the responsibility on the individual. It's not what I believe, right? It's what I'm doing. In other words, I have to be concerned, okay, maybe I don't believe exactly the way I should do, but the important part is, what am I doing?
Right.
Right? What am I doing? So we have to look at from the fact that, okay, by the way, I'm not saying it's not important that you have specific beliefs.
Right.
You should have those, and you should have really true ideas and true concepts of God. That's a good place to start. But the most important thing is what am I doing? Am I striving to better myself and to better individuals without taking away from the other individual? And what you said is very true, because Eob in the book of Job, he brings up this subject about pleasing God. And what he does say is, he says, if you're righteous, in other words, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, who does that affect? Well, it doesn't affect God. It doesn't change him in one way or the other, because God's unchangeable. But it does affect me, and of course it will affect you if I'm living a righteous life, and the people around me.
Right.
On the other hand, if I'm living a wicked, evil life, it does exactly the same thing, of course in a negative way.
Right, it still affects us.
It still affects us in some way. So we, at least looking at the Torah, the Tanakh, we are taught to understand that we all have an ultimate goal, and that's the perfection of the individual. And if every individual perfects itself to its ability, then we live within a perfected society, right? And that really is, if you want to use the word heaven, that is really heaven, right? Because then you have a perfected society. I've often said if people would just keep three of the laws, don't kill, don't steal, and don't commit sexual immoralities, what kind of world would we live in? It would be unbelievable. No locks. Lock companies would be out of jobs, right? You wouldn't have to worry about investing your money with people. Why? Because they would never steal from you. You wouldn't have to worry about the Madoffs of the world or anybody else that's going to rob you because you make certain investments. No. You know why? Because they're looking out for your good. And that's really the story. So if we look at the 7 laws, don't look at them as this thing of not bringing about perfection to the individual. But I do want to bring a point up, and this is a point that Michael Dallin makes in his book. It's called, of course, the Rainbow Covenant, Torah and the 7 Universal Laws. And on page 66, he makes a interesting observation based on some texts in the Tanakh. One's from the book of Eob, the book of Job, and the other's from the book of Malachi. But he says, in relationship to the 7 laws, he says, there's more. As you go deeper into this study, you will encounter the following remarkable principle. And here's a principle that you run into. No one is virtuous unless he goes so far as to do the very opposite of what the Noahide Laws forbid. Now, if you take that, in other words, what is going to really make us virtuous? Now, we're not commanded, but you have to think about it in this sense. I have a prohibition against idolatry, okay? Now, nowhere in the 7 laws do I have a positive admonition that tells me I should worship God. Right? But it's very obvious from the prohibition against worshiping other gods that I would have to follow the positive aspect of worshiping the one true God.
Right.
And of course, involved in that, by the way, would be a great study of developing true and correct ideas about who God is, or maybe about who God is not.
Right.
So, you know, for most of us, that would be a lifetime study of just trying to understand that we are to worship this one God, a God that we can't see, that we can't touch, that we can't put our arms around and hug and have all these gushy, nice, emotional feelings about it, but a God that we can learn about, and that He's gave us enough information about Himself that it can bring us to the point that we desire to worship Him, that we desire to love Him, that we desire to do the right thing.
Right.
Right? So, even though we don't have this commandment that says you shall worship, right? Israel has such a commandment, but we don't. But we do.
It seems to be inherent within the prohibition.
Exactly. Because if I'm prohibited from worshiping the other God, then it's quite obvious.
You have to recognize and worship the only God.
I have to recognize and worship the only God there is, right? There's an interesting passage. If you'll hold that for just a minute, I'd like to find this and just read it to you. When Solomon was dedicating the temple of God, as in his dedication, of course this is in the book of 1 Kings, when he was dedicating the temple, he makes some amazing statements, especially in relationship to the non-Jew, by the way, right? And this is in 1 Kings 8, and he begins in, let's see, verse 41. And he's talking about coming to the temple and praying, right? And he says, moreover, concerning a stranger, a ger, right? And then he says, that is not of thy people Israel. Now he gets really specific, right? So we have a ger, he's a stranger. But he wants us to know this individual is not part of Israel.
Which would not be a convert.
No, he's not a convert.
Because if you're a convert, then you are part of Israel.
Right. He's just a stranger, right? Not a convert, not of the people of Israel. But he cometh out of a far country for thy name's sake. That's an interesting statement, for thy name's sake. Why? I mean, the obvious question you should, well, why are they coming for his name's sake? For they shall hear of thy great name, and of thy strong hand, and of thy stretched out arm, which these are all anthropomorphic terms, right? Strong hand, of his omnipotence, his might, of his stretched out arm, his ability to save, you know, and not soteriologically, but to rescue people, to deliver people, right? Because what happens, of course, in Egypt, everybody hears about that, right? And it says, when he shall come and pray toward this house, the temple, this is Solomon, King Solomon, he says, hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and do according to all that the stranger called to thee for, that all the people of the earth, all peoples, right, may know thy name, to fear thee as do thy people Israel, and that they may know that this house which I have been built is called by thy name.
Right, and anybody who is a true student and they start investigating the name of the Creator,
yes,
the Almighty, blessed be He, when they start studying that, they're going to find something very interesting.
Absolutely.
That name is a unique name.
Exactly.
That name is not one that should be thrown around lightly.
No.
Not even in different translations. That's a name that only has 4 consonants.